a lily pad to land on, but for George Santos, there doesn't appear to be a safe lily pad. The United States House of Representatives is attempting to expel a member of Congress who has not been convicted of a crime. In the history of our country, folks, only 5 members have been expelled from Congress. 1861, John Clark, John Reed, Henry Burnett were expelled on the grounds for treason for supporting the Confederate rebellion. In 1980, Michael Myers was convicted of bribery involving an FBI sting that led to the convictions of 7 members of Congress. 6 of them resigned, and Myers was expelled on a vote of 376 to 30. Then in 2002, James Trafficant was convicted on 10 counts, including bribery, conspiracy to defraud the United States, corruption, obstruction of justice. All 5 of these men had one thing in common, and they were all convicted under federal law and then rightfully expelled from Congress. Kicking out Mr. Santos is setting a very dangerous precedent. Never before has Congress expelled a member based on indictments. Indictments require nothing more than probable cause. An indictment is not a conviction. So why today would we remove a member from this House based on an indictment? It's never been done before. It shouldn't happen today. In this country, I thought everyone is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. I do not, and have not, and will not support the removal of Representative Santos, and I encourage my colleagues to agree. With that, I yield back.
I reserve.
Gentleman yields back.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I'd like to yield 1 minute to the ranking member of the Ethics Committee, Ms. Wild.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, as ranking member of the Committee on Ethics, I rise in support of House Resolution 878, which seeks to expel George Santos from the House of Representatives. One of our most basic obligations as members of Congress is to adhere to the principle that public office is a public trust. As the Ethics Committee's report lays out in thorough detail, Mr. Santos has repeatedly, egregiously, and brazenly violated the public's trust. Mr. Santos is not a victim. He is a perpetrator of a massive fraud on his constituents and the American people. In fewer than 9 months, and despite Mr. Santos's non-cooperation and numerous attempts to mislead the committee, the Ethics Committee compiled a staggering factual record against him. And my colleague, Chairman Guest, has already outlined all of the subpoenas and pages of documents and witnesses, and I'm not going to go through that again. But let me just say that the staggering factual record—
It's expired.
May I ask for 1 more minute?
30 seconds.
Thank you. This achievement owes to the superb work of the committee's nonpartisan attorneys and investigative staff, who I would like to sincerely thank for their efforts and dedicated service to the House. And I just want to remind everyone that the Ethics Committee is the only committee in Congress that is completely bipartisan, an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, and this was a unanimous decision. Thank you.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Santos, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield time, as much time as he may consume, to my colleague, Clay Higgins.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, many times in the course of my life as a military police officer and a civilian police officer, I've had occasion to say, calm down, son. I've heard your argument. I feel your passion. I understand your position. But you're about to go too far. Just calm down and step back. This is what I advise my colleagues on both sides of the aisle today. One of my one of my brothers here, whom I love and respect, these men seated here, they're making a mistake, Mr. Speaker. One of the gentlemen said we should be held to a higher standard, talking about the removal of a member of Congress. The American people to believe that the opinions of congressmen is a higher standard than the deliberate vote of the American people? Is a report from a committee a higher standard than the 2-year election cycle as established by our founding fathers and enshrined in our Constitution? Calm down. Mr. Speaker, I've spoken for 7 years to this body here, standing here, and very rarely have I had a prepared statement, nor do I today, but I'm going to read a letter that I distributed to my Republican colleagues for the benefit of my Democratic colleagues that did not receive a copy of the letter. Perhaps I'm wrong for that. I had considered sending you all this letter, and I did not, and I apologize for that, because the media has gotten it, and it's out there. Although I completely respect the work of our colleagues on the Ethics Committee, I have serious concerns about the way this particular case is being handled, and I'll oppose the George Santos expulsion. In the 7 years I've been a member of Congress, many members have been subject to campaign expenditure ethics investigations. To my recollection, members have always had the opportunity to settle the matter by restitution, even if they disagreed with the Ethics Committee conclusions. Further, in many prior instances of allegations of misconduct, I recall no massive media release from the Ethics Committee. After a bit of a whispered brush fire, the matter just went away. Maybe the member left Congress, maybe the member didn't leave Congress, but they weren't publicly crucified and expelled. The very fact that we have all read the quote-unquote investigative report indicates a level of public character assassination that I have not witnessed through 4 terms of congressional service. It's troubling to me that a Republican-led ethics committee would present itself as so judgmental. Previous ethics committees' investigations have always been conducted quietly, reflective of our constitutional standards of innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Reports of similar allegations of campaign finance violations, like family vacations overseas and cosmetic dental procedures and sexual adventures of every sort, have not historically been released to the public. This particular Ethics Committee investigation seems to be quite public, and I'm not seeing any allowance for the member to make restitution of alleged campaign finance violations. Full media disclosure, combined with intention to move straight to expulsion, appears weaponized to me. Colleagues, you can believe what you like, but the 56-page investigative subcommittee report is most certainly not written within the parameters normally found in an unbiased, impartial investigative report. It's filled with conjecture, opinion, and pejorative language that no professional investigative report should include, no experienced cop would present to a DA, and no impartial DA would ever present to a court as unbiased. You may accept this report as grounds for expulsion from Congress, but I say no. It's not right. The totality of circumstance appears biased. It stinks of politics, and I'll oppose this action in every way. Perhaps my colleagues should step back from expulsion, look in the mirror, reflect upon the long-established historical record of congressional behavior, consider the founders' intent, and let we, the people of New York, determine their representative. This report is posing as an objective presentation of fact, yet it is most certainly written with notable disregard for professional objectivity, and it's wrapped in a media-incensed public disclosure that any reasonable man can see is a congressional equivalent of a public crucifixion. I'm stunned that members would cheer for this public shaming and expulsion. It's like witnessing an otherwise fair and compassionate village gather to celebrate the burning of an alleged witch. Since the Civil War, only 2 members of Congress have been expelled, and both have been convicted in court of federal crimes. That's the standard, and the House of Representatives should not deviate from that standard. I'm a solid no on expulsion, and I encourage every member to carefully consider what kind of precedent we're setting here. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate this opportunity to encourage my colleagues sincerely on both sides of the aisle to step back from this expulsion. I yield.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Esposito.
Well, thank you. And as I fully respect my friend from Louisiana and have much love for him, I want to reassure no one is cheering for this ethics report. And with that, I'd like to yield as much time as he may consume to my friend from New York and fellow Long Islander, Mr. Lalota.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to address 3 issues in hopes of persuading my colleagues from both sides of the aisle who at this moment are either against or undecided about expelling George Santos to ultimately vote yes. Those 3 issues are fraud, due process, and election integrity. Regarding fraud, Mr. Speaker, both federal and state laws would require jail time or a monetary fine or both for any of our constituents who tricked another person into an agreement to another American's disadvantage. Here, in the 2022 election, by his own admission, George Santos induced New York voters and donors throughout the nation to support him by fraudulently creating an entire new person that donors and voters would support. Santos did this intentionally, figuring the uneducated, underemployed, and person of simple means he actually is could not earn the support of voters and donors. The facts of George Santos's fraud are not in dispute. George Santos is not the person he offered to voters. He didn't work where he said he did. He didn't go to school where he said he did. He's far from rich. He isn't Jewish. And his mother was not in the South Tower during 9/11. So the argument that New Yorkers voted George Santos in and that we should wait until November of 2024 for voters to decide his fate is inherently flawed, since voters weren't given a chance in the first chance to determine who they were actually voting for, Mr. Speaker. So while our constituents would go to jail or be fined for similar lies, one question we have before us today is that are we going to hold George Santos to the same standard which our constituents are held, or a lesser one? Regarding due process, Mr. Speaker, we should clear some things up. It's been a while since I took Professor Sample's civil procedure class or Professor Kuh's constitutional law class, but the due process clauses of our 5th and 14th Amendments do not apply to House proceedings. Rather, the constitutional proceedings which do apply here is Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2, which states clearly and simply, each House may determine the rules of its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior, and, with the concurrence of 2/3, expel any member. It's that simple, Mr. Speaker. So while constitutional due process does not apply here, George Santos has actually been afforded every single element of it through the bipartisan ethics committee process. Due process requires notice, an opportunity to be heard, and a decision by a fair and impartial tribunal. First, Santos got his notice when the Ethics Committee informed him of the probe into his conduct. Second, Santos had every opportunity to be heard when the Ethics Committee invited him to confront the accusations against him, an invitation Santos rejected. Finally, his tribunal is us, the House of Representatives, whose collective impartiality is proven every day by the partisan fights we have every day, day in and day out. So, Mr. Speaker, while this proceeding is not covered by the due process clauses, George Santos has indeed been afforded much more process than a person in his shoes deserves. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I would like to speak on the matter of election integrity. Before I came to the House, I was my county's elections commissioner for 7 years, where I fought for more integrity in our elections. As elections commissioner, I fought for removing deceased voters from our rolls, for voter ID, against fraudulently submitted absentee ballots, and against voters being registered in 2 different places. Following the 2016 and 2020 elections, members of Congress from both sides of the aisle voted not to certify those elections, stating the results were not reliable. Tomorrow, by voting yes to expulsion, Republicans and Democrats can stand for election integrity and against voter fraud, because there is no more provable case of election fraud before this Congress than George Santos's 2022 election fraud. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I would like to offer that New Yorkers from Queens and Nassau counties deserve better than George Santos, a total fraud and a serial liar representing them in Congress. Each day that Mr. Santos is allowed to remain a member of Congress, my New York neighbors to the west are being denied real representation in these halls. That is because their representative is incapable of getting a bill passed, a project funded, or even sitting on a committee, because he lacks the minimum amount of trust necessary to be a member of Congress. Today, the best way to support my fellow New Yorkers and overcome George Santos's fraud is to expel George Santos from the House of Representatives. I yield, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Santos, is recognized.
I'd like to yield as much time as he may consume my colleague from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I do not believe that the Long Island crew is acting in bad faith, just exceedingly bad judgment. And here's why. Since the beginning of this Congress, there's only two ways you get expelled. You get convicted of a crime, or you participated in the Civil War. Neither apply to George Santos. And so I rise not to defend George Santos, whoever he is, but to defend the very precedent that my colleagues are willing to shatter. Now, let's speak to due process. Mr. Santos hasn't been convicted of anything, but we haven't even moved to expel the people who have. Mr. Bowman pled guilty to a misdemeanor for his little fire alarm stunt weeks ago. So, while the Ethics Committee is marching to throw George Santos out of Congress, they take no action as to someone who actually pled guilty to a crime? What's that all about? And then there's all this talk about, well, he could have come and testified to the Ethics Committee, and he didn't. So he had his due process. But that belies the fact that he faces a trial, and had Mr. Santos testified before the Ethics Committee, an argument could have been made that he waived any of his rights that he would have had at trial that any American would enjoy. So it was a procedural double bind that shouldn't be held against Mr. Santos as some sort of adverse inference. Let's also talk about this precedent. The fact pattern as to Mr. Santos is remarkably similar to the fact pattern of former Representative Duncan Hunter. Duncan Hunter used campaign money on girlfriends and trips and home improvements and all sorts of personal lavishes. He was indicted for those crimes and continued to serve in Congress. He pled guilty to a number of those crimes and continued to serve in Congress. He was in Congress for an additional pay period after having pled guilty to the very same things that Mr. Santos has been indicted for. And so I think it's persuasive to me that Mr. Higgins and Mr. Nels, two law enforcement officials with sterling reputations, are here not necessarily to defend Mr. Santos, but to defend this precedent and this due process that is being shattered. And I was struck when the author of this resolution said the quiet part out loud. He didn't try to shoehorn the expulsion of George Santos into some existing construct or precedent. He said, yep, we're making a whole new precedent. We're making whole new rules right now. But he defends that by saying that the new rules are better, that it's a higher standard. So we should just throw away everything that's happened from the first Congress to the 118th because the new precedent is more robust. The problem is it's a lower standard for due process without merit. Mr. Speaker, whatever Mr. Santos did with Botox or OnlyFans is far less concerning to me than the indictment against Senator Menendez, who's holding gold bars inscribed with Arabic on them from Egypt while he is still getting classified briefings today. But he's not getting thrown out of the Senate. He's getting classified briefings under indictment for bribery. But what? Because Santos was buying Botox and OnlyFans, we got to throw him out? If George Santos is convicted, he ought to be expelled. But until then, it is an incredibly dangerous thing for people in Washington, D.C. to substitute their judgment for the judgment of voters. Winston Churchill said that, you know, in a democracy, people get the government that they deserve. Well, the people of Mr. Santos's district elected him. And like, this is not some district in rural Mississippi with like one newspaper. This is New York City. And George Santos rolls in there, wins, and you know what? It's between him and his voters, him and the justice system, and the fact that the Ethics Committee has done this incredible violation of precedent will do grave damage to this institution for many years to come, because now there's no requirement of any conviction. There is a departure from the precedent from the Duncan Hunter matter and many others, and I fear what that may indicate lies ahead for the future of due process in the House of Representatives. I yield back.
Yep. Gentleman reserves.
I yield 1 minute to Mr. Garcia.
That was great.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, truth and justice are crucial components of a healthy and strong democracy. It speaks to the public trust we hold and the dignity of this institution. As a freshman member of Congress, I take the oath very seriously. I love this country deeply, and we should all have intentions to defend it. That's why I rise today to defend the integrity of the House and to support the expulsion of Representative Santos. I wish no personal harm to the representative from New York, and I imagine this is a difficult moment for him and for the institution. But I believe strongly in his actions, and he must be held accountable for them, as well as his lies. He fabricated his qualifications, his background, lied to the FEC, and unemployment fraud. That's why he's under a serious 23-count indictment. The bipartisan report is out. It's damning. It should convince all members to vote for this expulsion. People want better from Congress. They want good and ethical government, and they deserve the truth. I once again ask the representative from New York to resign and save himself and the country from this vote. And if not, I encourage a yes vote to restore integrity to the body and to expel Representative Santos. I yield back.
Gentleman from California yields. Gentleman from New York.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized. Mr. Santos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I hear a lot the line, I encourage Representative Santos to resign, do the right thing, which is resign. What I hear is people don't want to take this vote. I'm just here. I'm willing to take the vote. Take the vote, guys. I'm okay with it. This is your time. This is what they've all built up to all year. The most damning feature of this farce is the total perversion of the priorities of this body and this conference, who ran on the commitment to America. Yes, witch hunting George Santos is great right there. I remember that on the top line of the commitment to America. This conference has failed to pass 4 different appropriations bills, Mr. Speaker. It had rules fail on the floor. We had members weaponizing the Rules Committee because it didn't do what they wanted. Our borders are wide open. It's no man's land, being run by NGOs. And yet, this Congress has now taken 3 measures and the insurmountable amount of time that goes behind them to expel a member duly elected by the people of the 3rd District of New York. You see, I didn't think that my tenure in Congress would be this way, Mr. Speaker. I came here to do work. I came here to pass and work on conservative legislation. I have a stellar conservative record that I am proud of. The work I've done in this body, I am proud of. The votes I've taken in this body, I am proud of. Every vote that I've taken that might have been against leadership, I stand by those votes. Not because I disrespect leadership, but because I want a more conservative agenda for our country. Now, I can't say the same thing about some of my colleagues, especially the ones most adamant to remove me, almost as if we remove him, there's no comparison. It's that much simpler. They can go home and say they're conservative. They won't know what a real conservative will look like on Long Island. That's just the reality. The votes are there. Now, let's talk about the fact of due process that everybody seems to say that I have taken and I've received. You know, it's no secret in this body that obviously I have an ongoing process with the DOJ. I was given a deadline, an unrealistic deadline, to testify before the committee the same day that I had to go to court. And they gave us a hardliner, yes or no answer. They wouldn't settle for anything else. That was the deadline. I could not surpass that date, which means it was either I go to New York City to adhere to my DOJ case, or I go to the Ethics Committee. No disrespect to the committee. I've incurred over $200,000 of legal fees that have been predominantly paid for. So to suggest that I have not complied with them is yet another lie. They have received every document they've asked, and documents we did not have, we have told them, we don't have them. We don't have access to what you're asking for. And they persisted and insisted in inventing documents, communication between myself and people that did not exist, thus communication, and we informed them. This was all on the record. But I rise and I question again to the chairman, will he set the record straight that his expulsion resolution contradicts the findings of his report? Which one is it? Am I guilty of a sexual harassment claim or am I not? The report says I'm not. His filing on this expulsion resolution says I am. That is a very serious allegation, one that I sought to see the end of, where the House, the Office of Congressional Ethics, sent a referral to the investigative subcommittee saying that they did not suggest further investigation into the matter because it lacked credibility. Yet it sits on their expulsion resolution. I call that hypocrisy, more lying, more swamp behavior from this body. The same reason that Americans have no trust in this body, because unfortunately far too often, too many of our colleagues here will speak from both sides of their mouths without regard to who it might hurt. As it is said, people in this town will hurt people a whole lot so they can benefit just a little bit. With that, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New
Mr.
York.
Speaker, how much time do I have remaining?
Gentleman has 2 minutes remaining.
2 minutes. All right. I'd like to yield 1 minute to my friend from New York, Mr. Molinaro.
Dear God, Mr. Speaker, my future former colleague is divorced from reality. He has manufactured his entire life to defraud the voters of his district an honest choice for a member of Congress. He has lied to donors and to colleagues, taking advantage of election law, using campaign funds to personally benefit himself. And he has defamed not only his office, but the institution itself. I was not elected, nor any of us, to defend precedent. I was elected to defend the United States Constitution. And my colleague, in the most truthful thing he said today, said we don't want to be compared to him. My colleague is damn right. I do not want to be compared to him. And the voters that sent me here expect an independent voice, expect us to use the rules of the House, and expect us to stand up for the very decency and laws of this country in protecting the Constitution. He has lost the right to serve in this House, and I will vote to expel him.
Gentleman
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from
I have
New York.
1 minute remaining.
1 minute
I'd like to
remaining.
yield 45 seconds to my friend from New York, Mr. Lawler.
Gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, is recognized.
Of all the lies that George Santos told, 2 are the most jarring. That his mother perished in 9/11, was in the building, got cancer from 9/11, or that his grandparents fled the Holocaust. In both instances, Mr. Santos used tragic events in history to try and propel himself to public office. Worse than that, he not only defrauded the voters of the 3rd District, he defrauded donors, stealing their money for personal gain. The facts and the evidence are clear. He can defend himself in a court of law, but for the purposes of this body, he's got to go. It's time to expel George Santos.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from New
How
York.
much time do I have left, Mr. Speaker?
Gentleman has 8 minutes remaining.
I reserve.
Gentleman.
I have 15 seconds remaining.
Gentleman has 15 seconds
I
remaining.
yield those last 15 seconds to my friend from Ohio, Mr. Miller.
Thank you.
Gentleman is recognized from Ohio.
Thank you. I'll keep this very brief. I myself have been a victim of George Santos, and as well as other members of Congress, in terms of defrauding through public donations. I had received an ethics complaint from the FEC, which I had to spend tens of thousands to defend myself. You, sir, are a crook. I know I should direct my comments to the chair. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Santos, is recognized.
I'd like to move to have the gentleman from Ohio's words stricken from the record, please.
Gentleman's request is not timely, but the chair will remind all members to direct their remarks to the chair and not to others.
Gentleman's request is not timely, but I would remind members to direct their remarks to the chair. Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, hypocrisy, as I mentioned. My colleague wants to come up here, call me a crook. Same colleague who's accused of being a woman beater. Are we really going to ignore the facts that we all have passed and we all have the media coming out against us on a daily basis? Every last one of us has struggled with every little ounce of what happens within public service. I didn't come here. I can go and read about all my colleagues. I'm not going to stand here to smear them. I'm not going to stand here and use the time I have to say ill things about my colleagues. I refuse to stoop to that level. Well, the only thing I want to make clear is, if tomorrow, when this vote is on the floor, it is in the conscience of all of my colleagues that they believe that this is the correct thing to do, so be it. Take the vote. I'm at peace. I have accepted that whether I get expelled or I don't, I have accepted that I cannot control that faith, Mr. Speaker. I have done the best I can to serve in this body and to deliver the best I can in my campaign promises to vote as a conservative voice in this body. I stand by that. And with that, I'd like to yield as much time as my colleague may consume. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I ask of my colleagues, again, very respectfully on both sides of the aisle, is to just step back from this moment and reflect upon the sacred right of the American people to determine their representation in our representative republic. This is not a right that has been enumerated for this Congress. The American people run this thing. I believe the people of the 3rd District of New York are quite capable of removing Representative Santos if they choose to do so. In the history of our nation, we have never done what we're poised to do. Since the Civil War, 2 members of Congress have been removed by expulsion, both having been convicted of federal crimes. The people of these United States own the sacred right to remove their representative. This is reflective of our oath, ladies and gentlemen. and I say this sincerely, my beloved colleagues, step back from this egregious act that you've threatened. Reflect upon the American people that we serve, the oath that we've sworn, and allow the people of New York to cast their vote as they see fit. Mr. Speaker, I am prayerful that righteousness will indeed touch the heart of every member of Congress in this consideration, just as I'm prayerful that righteousness touches the heart as the voting Americans across the country determine who their representative will be. And I have faith that this anointed nation, touched by the hand of God, as our Constitution was debated and developed and the writ thereof was determined, I have faith in that document, and I am prayerful that my colleagues, Republican, and my colleagues, Democrat, will grant that sacred right, as determined by our Constitution, to the people to whom it belongs, in this case, the people of the 3rd District of New York. Mr. Chairman, I encourage all members to oppose the expulsion of Representative George Santos, and I yield.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields. Without objection, the previous question is ordered on the resolution. The question is on the adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the resolution is adopted. Gentleman from New York.
I'd like to request a recorded vote.
Does the gentleman request the yeas and nays?
Yes, sir.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number have risen. The yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. Oh, okay.
Let's take a sec here.
All right. Pursuant to House Resolution 891 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the further consideration of H.R. 5961. Will the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe, kindly take the chair?